In this video, I'll be covering the beginning of getting yourself going with server interactions. So I've gone ahead and created a new card in our cards folder here. I've gone to the cards namespace and added it to the require, and I just kind of copied everything from our mutations part 2 in here, renamed the card to server interactions, navigated to the index, made sure the card was coming up. It still looks the same as it did when we started out. Reload there and see the full initial state. We still have the double click where we can edit our label. It goes into state. Alright, so we have something that's starting to look like a to-do list. It's all local. Let's see what it looks like to make this talk to a server. So, show you around a little bit. In the source main folder of your Linigan template, there is a server main. This is meant for production, so this isn't what starts your server when you're in development. What starts your server in development is actually this user namespace. And so if we look at the user namespace has the fig wheel function in it. This is for starting up the fig wheel builds that we've been playing with for cards. There's a set refresh strs. This is necessary because the fig wheel compile copies things into the resources folder, which is on your class path. And when we want to reload the server, it'll actually accidentally reload any closure code that's ended up in the resources, which can be from all sorts of libraries. So this is a really important thing to have. And then we've got some functions for stopping, starting, and restarting our server. So this is all kind of pre-built for you in the template, so you can do kind of hot code reload on the server as well. And then in beginning Fulcro, basically it's recommended you just use the easy server, which takes about this amount of code to make a server. So you have to tell it a config file as a path, and that can be relative, in which case it will find it in your source or resources somewhere on your class path. So actually I believe it's in source main config. You have to have a defaults ident, and it has to be called defaults ident. That has, it can be an empty map, but you can default values here. We're going to be using dev ident, which just is a copy of defaults essentially. So when your server starts, it's going to load the defaults. That's going to override anything in whatever other file you tell it to load. It's going to merge these on top of that. So that way you end up with a full set of configuration. If you give an absolute path, it uses a file in the file system. So that's really the intention, is when you deploy this to a server, you want to give it a path that's an absolute path, and then you want your sysadmin to have control over this disk file. That's just an ident disk file that they can use to configure your software. Very common need in environments, but you'd like to be able to use just a file on your workspace for development, whether that be on the disk or in the source of the thing itself. So we need to give it a config path, which we allow to come in as an argument. And if you look at server main here, I think we passed that in as config prod, but you could modify this to use the command line arguments or system properties, whatever. Completely up to you. But the server itself, this is really all you need. The Fulcro server goes ahead and hooks up a query parser or an expression parser on the server side that understands all these queries and mutation syntax we've been using on the client. It supports steward components. You can actually inject things into your environment like databases and such, so they're available when you're processing these things. And I'm going to do something a little simpler than what it suggests in the template here. Maybe I'll just go ahead and use what's in the template and then show you an alternate way of doing it. So that's all we need to get a server going. So we just need to go into edit configurations there. I did it up here at the configurations menu. I'm just going to duplicate the cards. Oops, not add. I'm going to duplicate that guy. I'm going to rename it server. I'm going to leave it closure main. I'm going to strip off the arg, strip off the parameters. So just make those blank. Hit OK, and I'm going to hit play. So pretty straightforward to get a closure REPL going. This gives us REPL integration for sending things from the editor to a closure prompt, which you can also do from the closure script prompt. This is actually why I have us start these this way through the Figwheel script and don't use the Linigan plugin. Is if you're in a file here, you can actually send with a keyboard shortcut and I've got mine mapped to a, but there's a send, top form to REPL, send form before caret, and I've got these set to Control C, Control F, and Control C, Control E. Send them to wherever you want. They're in the keyboard shortcuts. And so when we set it up this way through the Run configuration menu, we're able to run our fig wheel through the REPL integration so that we get these really nice features for more advanced development. That's all I'm going to say about that for now. So all we have to do down here to get our servers going is say go. Done. So we have a server running. You see it loaded the defaults. It overrode that with dev. It tells you what the final loaded configuration is. It started the web server on 3000, so now we should be able to switch our port here to 3000. It'll look exactly the same, but now we're connected via a port where we're in control of the server. Before it was Figwheel, and Figwheel just knows how to serve resources, but it doesn't know how to answer any other kind of request. So it kind of makes sense that we'd switch away from the Figwheel server, where it's just serving things out of this resources public directory. Right, cards and index. That's how we were getting those, and the JavaScript is Figwheel starts a little mini ring server that can serve those, but that's all it can do. Easy Server can do that plus respond to API requests, which is what we want. Okay, so just to give you a feel for the next piece here, we'll go back to server interactions. We've set up a query and ident on a to-do list. We've set up a query and item on to-do item. That's a nice graph-like thing, really straightforward. In the DefCard Fulcro, actually does essentially, if we go look at the client over here, it makes one of these. It makes a new Fulcro client. And new Fulcro client accepts a number of arguments. You can pass in a started callback. You can pass in alternative networking. You can augment the database reader. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do in here as options to new Fulcro client. When you're working in the dev cards, you can actually pass any of those options by just adding a Fulcro key right here. So we're going to add a started callback, and this is just a function that gets the started application and is called when the thing starts. So I'm just going to log something, and I'm going to remind you to make sure that your cache is disabled when DevTools is open, so you don't end up with caching problems, and that you want the custom filters, the custom formatters enabled in here, so you have a better console experience. So with the custom formatters, you should see this when you load DevTools enabling features formatters. Now if I reload this page, which will cause the started callback to trigger, I should see a keyword started because I logged a keyword. If you don't have the custom formatters, you see the actual JavaScript representation of a keyword, which is as a JS object. So it's a little ugly. Okay, so I'm ready to start talking to a server. Our data fetch system has the idea that we're going to be, remember our database is right here, and this root node, the map itself is what I consider the root node, has some edges. Root to-do list is a pointer from the root node to something in a table, but it also is special in that it contains your tables. So I don't consider these kind of part of the root node, they just kind of are co-located, is the way I think about it. So even though they're there, I don't technically consider them part of the root node, because the root node doesn't ask for them. This is what's in the root node as far as I'm concerned, is what it queried for React key and to-do list. So to-do list and React key, locale, I'm not querying for it, but it's there. It's kind of a built-in. So my graph is built off of this. Our load story just leverages the fact that everything's either in an entity in a table, right, one level deep essentially. You've got a table name, the ID of the thing from its index, and then the thing itself. Graph edges go from there and make the rest of the graph, but everything's in a table entry or it's in the root node. That's essentially it. These, terminology-wise, I refer to as entities because they just typically represent some sort of thing you're persisting and tracking state on that has some identity. And then of course I've got the root node. our loading facility, which is the data fetch namespace, we can pass it an app, and I'm going to let it auto import, but it's Fulcro client data fetch. I have to give it the app, and then by default what it wants to do is load things into the root node. So I could say my new thing, I can just make up a key there, and then I can tell it the kind of thing that I want to load, and I do that by giving it a defsc component name. So for example, I could say to do item is the thing I want to load. Now of course I haven't defined anything on the server, but I'm just going to throw that in there just to kind of show you basically what happens. And of course it's a started callback, so I need to reload to trigger a start, and we can now go look at what happened. So what we see is there was a server error. It told us we couldn't figure it out, and over here in the server console we can see it saying the same thing. Somebody asked us to read my new thing, and we don't know how to do that. But notice there's now a my new thing edge here, and what it has in state is a big status marker telling you what was asked for and how it went and how it failed, and a whole bunch of information. And we can actually add some parameters, which I'm going to do, to this load, and I'm going to turn the markers off for right now. That's what that is a marker, and so with the markers off, it won't plop something in place there. So you see it's not there yet because it didn't load. But we still get this global Fulcro server error, and you can read the dev guide more about what all you can see in terms of errors for handling and how you can deal with those. We're more interested in actually getting some data in here. So that's sort of what it looks like. So let's go over to the server here, and this API folder, source main demo API read CLJ, is where it suggested you define your reads. And we're trying to define a query that goes against the idea of the root node, right? We don't have a specific entity. Well, we could go with respect to an entity, but I'm going to start with just the root, and I'm just going to assume that the server only knows about one to-do list. So I'm going to have it understand how to query for to-do list. So def query root, you give it that, and then you give it a little section where you say the value, and then you'll get the environment that you can set up for the server, and you'll get the parameters that are passed you from the client, and then you can just respond with whatever a to-do list is supposed to look like. So I'm going to start out with just literal data. So I'm going to give it a DB ID. I'm going to look over here at our definition of a to-do list. It's got an ID, it's got a name, it's got items. List name, list items. So list name, my list items, none. Right? Just something really simple. In the server prompt down here, I'm going to call restart, and you'll see that reloads the code of the server. And it's very important for me. I'm going to go double check this just to make sure. The demo server, you have to require those namespaces, because essentially what those macros do is they define multi-methods, or they do def methods on an existing multi-method that this server object is using to process the reads. So if you don't require them, they don't run. If they don't run, you don't get the multi-method insertions, and then you don't get any response. So that's all good. So the server should actually be able to respond now to a query for the keyword to-do list that's expecting whatever data this thing is querying for. And I'll show you a little bit more here in just a second, but let's go ahead and change our load here to load to-do list. And now you can start to see why I was careful to call this root to-do list as far as what the root node was querying for right here, right? I made this up. And because I can load things into the root node as a data fetch mechanism, I want to kind of try to avoid accidentally stomping on state that would screw with my root node itself. So that's a big gotcha, and I haven't found a great way to get around this other than just namespace things. In fact, I should be namespacing things here, but I'm being a little lazy. All right, so now if I reload, I should see a to-do list come in, and now I have where's the new key? Loading loads, to-do list, here it is. But the to-do list is pointing to a to-do item by ID. Why did that happen? Oh, because I have the wrong kind of query. This is supposed to be a to-do list. It normalized it, right? It normalized it with the idea that it was going to be a to-do item because that's what I told it I wanted it to query. But on the server, I didn't pay attention to what was asked for. I just returned blindly data, so it didn't match up. So let's fix our query there. Go back over here, reload, and trigger our read. And so now we see our to-do list disappeared in the UI. You see the refresh because what we did was we overwrote the to-do list by ID 1 that was in our initial state. So let's go over to our server here, and I didn't intend to do that. Let's make this like ID 100 or something. Let's restart our server, reload our build here, and now our to-do list won't change, but we'll see now we have a new list, my list. Oh, well, I gave it the same name. Aren't I good? In our state. So that's really all there is to it. The data driven is really that simple, and you notice that it normalized. It put the to-do list in the to-do list table and made the top level to-do list key point at it. So we get normalization out of this. In fact, now if we go in here and we add some list items, so let's do a little better job here. So we have 1, 2, and 3. So let's add 4. This is going to be an item label X. Let's just add 1. And I guess we ought to put an item complete in it. Now let's start it out true. Restart our server, so the server's got the updated read. Reload here, and now we'll see we get our to-do list 100. 100 has items which are normalized to item 4, label X. So you can see that the queries on the components are already giving us this huge bonus. All we have to do is say go get it. All the server has to do is say here it is. State takes care of itself, and UI can refresh. In fact, now that we've got an item in there, and in fact I'm just gonna so there's a little more to look at. So now that there's something in there, dbid, let's change this back to 1 and overwrite our initial state intentionally. Reload, and now we see X checked, Y not checked. All normalized just as we would expect it. So now we can undo some of the stuff that we did earlier that was kind of silly, right? We don't necessarily have a to-do list that has initial state. Doesn't make sense for a to-do list to have initial state. It doesn't make sense for a to-do item to have initial state because it's coming from the server. So you see how we walked through the dev cards and put together the UI. We could use initial state to pretend like it was there, and now we can go and strip it out and just use a load to pull the state in. So now I won't have these extra to-do items in my database. All right. Now I do want to show you the next little piece. The next little piece is if I go here to read some of the stuff that you're getting in your environment. The big thing that you're getting is the query. So I'm going to restart the server. And so this is where the other half of the data-driven comes in. Is right now I'm just blindly returning whatever I think the client wants. I'm doing a REST-like thing, right? REST endpoint said you get to-do list, you get whole to-do list. Well, what if it was just trying to show a list of to-do lists and it really didn't want the list items? What if it didn't want to ask for those? Well, in your UI, you would have coded that. Maybe you have a, instead of, right, there's the full-blown to-do list, but maybe this is a to-do list summary or something like that where you don't actually want to pull the list items in. You just want to use that against, say, maybe the server. And maybe you don't even want a UI. This is a perfectly valid thing to do. I can define something with a query and ident to use just for loading some initial stuff. So now I can go in here and say to-do list. I want the to-do list summary. Right? Now, the thing that's going to happen, you're maybe going to get something different on the UI than you expect when I do this. Oh, and let's, yeah. I got the to-do list, I got the list name, and I still got the list items. Notice that this time, though, they didn't normalize. And there's a couple things going on here. First, though, I do want you to see that on the server, I got the right query. That's what I asked for, dbid list name, but I responded with the wrong data. And so what Fulcro does when it gets kind of extra stuff is it goes ahead and still merges it, but because it doesn't know what this stuff is for, it just ends up being opaque data to Fulcro. So no normalization happens, there's no query for it, right? There was no query joined in here. So it's important when you actually start moving towards the data-driven story that your server responds correctly. And you can look in the dev guide at the parsing sections for server interactions and such. Essentially what I should have returned here now, since this is a summary, is that. All right, if I now restart my server, reload this, right, I get to-do list 1 and no items. So that's kind of a teaser for what the data-driven story should look like. I'm not going to go into great detail on writing any more of the server here. It can be as simple as using the query to do a select keys on the data you're returning, right, just to pare it down. It can be as complex as running a true pull query against Atomic, or using Fulcro SQL to run an accurate graph query against an SQL database. All of those are good solutions. There's a Pathom library that's good for helping you build parsers for this query language to give back exactly what you want to give back. Okay, so let me take this back. I'm going to get my two list items. I'm going to go back to my server interactions. I've loaded this. I'm going to change this back to to-do list. Get rid of the extra stuff I made. Reload. And now I've got my to-do list. Now note, root to-do list, I haven't initialized that, right? So the thing that root is querying for, the root to-do list, is coming in nil because its initial state, I told it to get the initial state of the to-do list. Well, there is no initial state on the to-do list, right? I kind of wiped out that part of initial state, so there really is no initial state whatsoever. So what's happening now is I'm pulling in, this is the query, but I really want that to point to it. And so there's another option for doing this, and that's target. And you can just give it a path as a vector. And so I just want this to be root to do list, and so I can literally pick that edge up, this pointer, this ident pointer, ask it to pick that up and relocate it to here. So now if I reload to trigger the start again, you can see now my UI is hooked up. Okay, so that's the next part. So that's the beginning of reads.